One of the finest albums of cowboy songs ever recorded was by a gentleman named Harry Jackson. Harry Jackson became a prominent Western artist, but in the 1930s and 40s, when he was a teenager, he worked on a ranch in Wyoming. And while he was there, he learned traditional cowboy songs from some of the folks that he worked with. In 1959, Harry Jackson recorded an album of those songs for Folkways Records. The album was called The Cowboy: His Songs, Ballads, and Brag Talk. He recorded the songs in a unaccompanied a cappella manner, the traditional way of singing those old-time cowboy songs, and he also included a few recitations. One of those was a piece called Some Cowboy Brag Talk. I liked it so much that I recorded it on my new album of cowboy poems entitled Cowboy Recitations. I'd like to recite that one for you today to kick off the show. This is Some Cowboy Brag Talk. I was born full-growed with 9 rows of jaw teeth and holes bored for more. There were spurs on my feet, a rawhide quirt in my hand, and when they opened the chute, I come out a-riding a panther and roping the longhorn whales. I've rode everything with hair on it, and I've rode a few things that was too tough to grow any hair. I've rode bull moose on the prod, she-grizzlies, and long bolts of lightning. Mountain lions are my playmates. When I get cold and lonesome, I sleep in a den of rattlesnakes, 'cause they always make me nice and warm. To stay alive, I eat stick dynamite and cactus. The Grand Canyon ain't nothing but my bean hole. When I get thirsty, I drink cyanide cut with alkali. When I go to sleep, I pillow my head on the Bighorn Mountains, lay my boots in Colorado and my hat in Montana. I can stretch out my arms clean out from the Crazy Woman Fork, plumb on over to the upper Gray Bull River. My bed tarp covers half of Texas and all of old Mexico. But there's one thing for sure and certain, and if you boys want to know, I'll tell you, that I'm still a long ways short of being the daddy of 'em all. 'Cause he's full-growed, and as any man that really knows can see, well, boys, I ain't nothing but a youngin'. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode I'll interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Martin Murphey. Murphey is a singer and a songwriter who's famous for such songs as What's Forever For, Carolina and the Pines, and Wildfire. But for the last 30 years, he's devoted himself to singing and promoting the songs of the West and of the cowboy. Recently, Murphey was passing through Lubbock on his annual Cowboy Christmas tour, and we sat down backstage at the Cactus Theater and did this interview. We did some of it before dinner, some of it after dinner, before the show, and then we finally finished up about midnight after the show, and Murphy drove me home before hitting the road himself to Amarillo, Texas, where he was playing the next night. We had a great time, and Murphy shared some wonderful stories with me. I started off by asking Murphy about learning cowboy songs as a kid in Texas. Here's Martin Murphey.
Well, I grew up in Dallas, Texas, in the city during the school year, with an occasional foray out to the ranches owned by my grandfather Ed, my uncle Lemoyne, my grandfather Oliver, and my large animal doctor veterinarian cousin, who was actually, I called him Uncle Billy because he was older. He was an older cousin of the family, but I called him Uncle Billy, and he was Texas A&M graduate. So between all those guys, I was around cattle and cattle ranching a lot. Now, Uncle Lemoyne and Granddaddy Corbett had a ranch in partnership in Arkansas also. Also, I would go in the summertime for extended lengths of time. And I did this from the time I was probably 6 or 7 years old. So I started off just being around all this stuff. So I would hear these guys just on their record players. And so they weren't musicians, but just on their record players that they had at home. Particularly my Uncle Lemoyne, who was a big music fan. He had Bill Monroe records, and he had old-time cowboy singer records. Well, I was just learning to play the ukulele at that time. My granddaddy, Spud, gave me my first guitar, but he was into Hawaiian music, not cowboy music. It was Spud Murphey, and he lived in Hawaii. I only saw him usually a couple of times a year when I was a kid. Later years, he came over 4 times a year. I was learning how to play the guitar. Later, about 13, 14 years old, I got my first guitar, but I was playing ukulele, and I would hear these songs, and I'd go to my dad and I'd say, let's learn these at home, because my dad played ukulele too. Let's work these up and let's find these songs that these guys are humming. And Uncle Lemoyne, though, had this record collection that he gave me of old 78s, that went back quite a few years. And I had a 1950s version of tape recorder, which was really an amazing thing to get to own a tape recorder back then, a reel-to-reel tape recorder. But they gave me one, and I managed to record these off my 78 record player and 45 record player, record these songs. Uncle Lemoyne gave me stuff, that went back to records of the early cowboy singers before Gene Autry and Rogers, like Vernon Dalhart. Vernon Dalhart had a lot of hits of the old-time cowboy songs, and he was from Texas. Carl T. Sprague, I heard that original record when I was a kid, because my uncle Lemoyne had it in his collection when the work's all done this fall. First time I heard Spanish as a Loving Tongue, though, which was something of an exotic song to hear when you were, a Baptist kid in Texas. They didn't talk about people having love affairs and sing these romantic songs, about a dalliance between an American cowboy and a Mexican senorita. First time I heard that, I was probably a freshman in college, and Ian and Sylvia came to play, and Ian Tyson was even doing a few cowboy songs back then, even though they were really known more as a folk singer group. Ian always wore cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, even then. He didn't always wear the hat on stage, but sometimes he did. And Gordon Lightfoot, I think, was influenced a lot by Ian Tyson. They were in the same age group, I think. And for some reason, I don't know who influenced who, but for some reason, that's the first time I heard songs like Spanish as a Loving Tongue and some of the more sophisticated. So, of course, I heard Four Strong Winds back then, which is really a cowboy song when you listen to it close. And Someday Soon, things like that, songs written by Ian Tyson. Four Strong Winds is about a drifter cowboy, though. And I heard these songs, and I worked them up, and I loved them. By the time I was 13 or 14 years old, I was a camp counselor at a place called Sky Ranch, which is a Christian youth camp in Louisville, Texas. Way out in the country in Louisville, Texas, right? Which is now just a suburban part of Dallas. But there were trees and cattle out there and deer and mountain lions living out there in that area. And we had this camp out there for kids, and they would come out. And these were city kids that had no connection at all with ranching or horseback riding or hunting or anything like that we did out on the ranches. So as a city kid, I related to them because I knew they didn't know this stuff. But as a country kid, on the weekends and in the summer, I was exposed to it. So instead of having an insider attitude like a lot of kids would at that age, kids are terrible at that age of, hey, I'm in the cowboy club and I'm not letting you in, or I'm in the classic car club, or I'm in the dragster club, or I'm in this gang or that gang. I wanted to teach these kids these things. I enjoyed it. Even though I was just a teenager myself, I had 5- and 6-year-old boys at this camp, and I taught them how to shoot. I taught them how to use bows and arrows. We had boys and girls at the camp, and so sometimes these little girls would come out and they'd learn to shoot too. It's the first time I remember in anywhere, actually the only time in the culture at that time that I ever saw girls hunting or shooting, because we taught them to go out and shoot, and they were in the Junior National Rifle Club. Little off the subject of cowboy songs, but it was teaching the culture to them. So my job primarily, besides teaching horseback riding, camping skills, canoeing skills, bow and arrow skills, things like that, was teach these kids a little bit about the culture they lived in, Texas. So I sang these cowboy songs at camp. I had my first guitar, I believe, by the time I was about 13 or 14. Played the ukulele, the little ukulele, and then a baritone ukulele up until then. Kingston Trio was really popular, so a baritone ukulele was an acceptable instrument. I can't remember his last name, but Nick in the Kingston Trio played a baritone ukulele sometimes, which is really the same tuning as the last 4 strings of a guitar without the bass strings on it. Then my granddad decided I needed to graduate to a bigger guitar, so he gave me a Martin guitar when I was young, and that's I guess that's probably the turning point in my life. When I got that Martin guitar, it sounded so beautiful. It sounded so great. And I was very, very fortunate to have a granddad who could afford a Martin guitar, because they're expensive now and they were expensive then.
You still have that guitar?
Still have that guitar.
What model is it? It's
a D28. It's a 1957 D28. Wow. So my family has the oldest continuously operated business by one family in the state of Texas, called Murphey the Jeweler on Main Street in Tyler, is now a historical marker. They've moved out to shopping malls since then. The two brothers that now run it, the two Murphy brothers, Shannon and Rick, and they have on opposite ends of the north and south side of town. They've got these jewelry stores, but they were pawn shops back when I was a kid as well. And a lot of times a jeweler would also be a pawn dealer, and they would take in musical instruments as well as watches and stuff like that. Watches would be their main business. So my family was around really good instruments, and so that's how he got the Martin guitar. It came into the shop, and he went to a store in downtown Dallas and got it appraised, as to what it was worth, and he gave it to me for my birthday. Then at that point, I started just going crazy learning cowboy songs. That was my main thing back then, was to sing cowboy songs around the campfire to these campers in the summer. And I had to work up a set list and everything. By age 17, I had my own television show in Dallas called Hometown Hootenanny, which was a summer replacement television show. Back then, you had these networks, just the 3 networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and they had shows that ran all 9 months of the year, and then the summertime, those shows didn't run, and then they had replacement summer shows that they would try out to see if they might make it to being a 9-month show. I sang a tremendous amount of cowboy songs back then as a teenager, 17 and 18 years old, and I did it on television, which was, back then, if you could get on television, that was huge, So I got on TV, and I had my own TV show as a teenager, and Pierce Allman was the moderator, who was a newsman on Channel 8, and I can't remember whether Channel 8 was NBC, ABC, or CBS, but that made me a local star. Back then, it wasn't a network deal. This was just a summer replacement. That's how they allowed local stations to access their public and have a little bit of power. It was for them to have their own replacement television shows in the summertime, and they would just be local. It would just be a Dallas show. So this was just in Dallas. It didn't get broadcast anywhere else in Texas. And that was right when videotape first came in. However, they erased the videotapes back then. After a season or two, they erased it. They erased it to save videotape. So there's no record of any of those shows anywhere anymore. There's some photographs in the Channel 8 Dallas records. So then, because of that TV show, I got hired to go out and play on ranches and stuff. And my family couldn't afford a whole bunch of vehicles, even though I was old enough to drive. So I used to hitchhike to those deals, and it was safe to hitchhike then. And as I went out to West Texas and places to play on ranches, I realized that the ranchers out there who were musicians knew more cowboy songs than I did. So I learned from them, and so I learned all the classics. I mean, they were around then. I'm not just talking about Happy Trails and Gene Autry music. I'm talking about the music that you play, Andy. You know, that you've gone for as a young man. You've gone way back into the absolute dungeons of the archives and dug a lot of stuff out. You're very, very fortunate to have been, raised here in Lubbock, where you have the greatest collection of archive of music of the Southwest ever that you can draw from through our mutual friend Andy Wilkinson. And I knew things like Strawberry Roan was part of my boyhood, but I sang it the way the old-time singers sang it with a chorus when it was a hit. Oh, that strawberry roan, oh, that strawberry roan, da 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 da. Oh, that strawberry roan, da 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 da. What I didn't know was I was singing Irish music too. That all those songs could be traced back to old Irish folk songs for the most part. There were a few that you couldn't trace to that, but very few. Streets of Laredo, all those songs I sang. Well, I'm a Murphy, so I was also around Irish music, and traditional Irish music was a part of our family. My grandfather even played the concertina, played Irish sailor type songs, you know, traditional Irish music. I can remember, gosh, the St. Anne's Reel, you know. All those songs we played. Now, we were Protestant Irish, not Catholic. But, so I heard all that stuff. It wasn't until I was much older that I made the connection. Wait a minute. You know, I have this, maybe I have a genetic proclivity toward cowboy music because it's so Irish. Carl Jung would have approved of that idea because Carl Jung said, you know, we have a collective memory that over the years gets into our brain patterns, and it's part of our evolving brain. I don't know why, but I was always attracted, even when I was just doing folk music and not doing cowboy music. I was always attracted to the child ballads by the English folklorist Child. I was attracted to the old Smithsonian collections of music, of Appalachian music that was very close to the child ballads and the English, and therefore Irish Celtic music, and that was my thing, you know. But I would sing some of these Irish songs, and I'd sing some of these cowboy songs, and I didn't really realize they were connected until much later. Just the boyhood thing, but that's where I first heard the music.
On April 16th, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote an open letter from the cell of a Birmingham jail. In that letter he said, "But again I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom." Since his first album, titled Geronimo's Cadillac, There's been a thread of activism woven through the work of Michael Martin Murphey, whether it's standing up for the rights of Native Americans or for the rights of American ranchers. While I was preparing for this interview, my friend Andy Wilkinson suggested that I ask Murphy about his involvement in the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
My dad inherited a bunch of property from my grandmother, and they were rental houses in South Dallas, and it was a segregated culture at that time. You know, all the black people lived in one part of town, and all the white people lived in another part of town, all the Mexicans lived in another part of town. But my dad would go over there and collect rent, and so I was always with him when he would go over there and collect rent. And then we had a guy named Hiram, who he met over there, who came over and helped Dad keep the house in order. And he was a maintenance man, basically. And then a wonderful black lady by the name of Miriam. And she was, it was literally like an Old South nanny kind of a relationship, you know, where my mother worked during the daytime, and she had to leave and go out and do church work and stuff. So this lady basically raised me and my little brother. So I was really, I thought black culture was a part of our family and the way black people talked, and that I never had any feelings. And then one day I was I probably was about 4 years old. One night, actually, there was a big fire across the street, and a cross burning in the yard, and I asked my mom, what's that? And she said, well, some black people tried to move in across the road, son, and the Ku Klux Klan came and lit that house on fire and left a burning cross over there. And so I said, well, why? You know, and I never could understand why. And so my mom said, well, that's just because some people feel like that the black people and the white people and the Mexican people shouldn't mix. So I grew up with a lot of feelings, sympathetic feelings in my heart about that. But it wasn't till when Eisenhower declared that the kids in Alabama were going to go to that school, it became national news, you know, that there used to be an attempt to end segregation. And I felt very sympathetic with the idea that should happen. So I got involved when I was a freshman in college. We had a black student who came to the Baptist Student Union, and the people that ran the Baptist, it was run by a First Baptist Church of Denton, Texas, because I was attending North Texas State University at that time, it was called. And it's Charles Green, and so our leaders said, well, we really don't know if we can have a black student in this group. And so we said, well, no, we want Charles to be a part of this thing. He said, well, you know, he'd have to join, you know, you have to be a member of the First Baptist Church in Denton to be a member of this student union, you know. Said, even while we're students here and we grew up in a different church, oh yeah, you got to join that church. And that was their way of trying to get Charles Green out of there. So we said, well, then Charles is going to come down and he's going to join the First Baptist Church in Denton, and that was the first black student that ever joined a Baptist Student Union in history. And I mean, a white Southern Baptist Student Union, you know. There were lots of black Baptists all over the place. And so I remember him standing up and coming down the aisle and bringing his church letter, which they used to call it, to join the church, and the whole place was just, it was controversial as it could be. And our preacher at the time, I can't even remember his name because it wasn't my home church. It's just where I went to church in Denton. He was against it, and people started getting up and making speeches. But Charles Green said, These are my friends at the student union, and they've taken me in, and I'm an orphan. I don't know my mom and dad, and I grew up, in an orphanage, and so I don't have any connection really to any family, and these people have taken me in like family, like brothers and sisters, and I want to join this church. He said, I'll sit by myself over in the side or in the back. He said, I won't make any trouble. I'm not here to do a civil rights protest or anything. He said, I just want to be a part of this church. And that did it. The church voted him in. And so he became a member. And then I got involved in activism. When I was a freshman in college was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in the streets of Dallas, my hometown. And then not much longer after that, Martin Luther King was shot at. They attempted to kill him in a protest march in Alabama. At the time, we all connected it to the Democrats and Lyndon Johnson that tried to promulgate integration in the schools, and we all believed that Kennedy was shot because he went along with Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy wasn't really real strong on civil rights, but he wasn't really known for that cause, but Lyndon Johnson was. So we went, when Reverend Reeb was killed in a march in Alabama, who was an Episcopalian minister who was shot dead, white guy, was shot dead in the streets. They almost killed Martin Luther King then. I got involved in a march that was organized in the streets of Dallas, less than a year after Kennedy was killed, and we marched right exactly the same route as the parade route of John F. Kennedy. And I was one of only 6 white kids, white people. We were all, teenagers. I wasn't even 20 years old yet as a freshman at North Texas, and I was one of 6 white people in that march. And my parents and my grandparents were just devastated. They just couldn't believe that I would get involved in that kind of political radicalism stuff. As Southern Baptists, we were supposed to be very quiet about that kind of stuff and not make trouble. Then we left Hillcrest Baptist Church. At that point, a bunch of us teenagers advocated to try to allow black people to join the church. And we're talking 1964 here, 63, 64. And they said no. The guy who was the pastor, Brother Furr, F-U-R, from North Carolina, was a staunch segregationist. And so we said, we want to propose that black people can join our church, and they said no, and they voted almost 100% no. And so me and a bunch of other kids in that church stood up and walked out and never came back. And our parents were just beside themselves. They thought we'd become a member of the Communist Party. And in some respects they were right, because Martin Luther King was a socialist. We all know that now, and there was a lot of socialism in that movement, because nobody believed that black white capitalist Southerners would ever accept white, black people, and therefore, it was a Republican Party. I mean, the Democrats were divided over that issue. You can read lots of books about it. I'm not going to go into it, but that's how I was drawn into it. And then, previous to that, in high school, we had one Mexican family in the high school, and one of the girls in that family went out for cheerleader, wanted to be cheerleader, and we got together and we in the whole high school, and we voted in the first Hispanic cheerleader in the school district in Dallas, and so. Everybody was saying that, we were what, seniors or no? I was a junior in high school at that point. I said, well, you get brown, the next thing you're going to have is black in here, and we're not going for that, and so I almost walked out on that high school, but the high school students voted to let her be a cheerleader because it was something that the kids could vote on, and then I got involved in the black thing, like I told you, and then I got interested in Native American rights, and so I've just always been a civil rights believer, because I so enjoy the different perspectives of different cultures and different races that they bring to the table, culturally, music, and of course, my relatives are one of the oldest families in Texas, and they were Irish, came to Texas, and I heard lots of stories about how much prejudice there was against the Irish. And the Irish were probably hated worse than the blacks and the Hispanics at one time. Not only in the South, but everywhere. If you look at the cartoons. The New York Times at that time, and our country really wanted to be very closely related to England. There was a lot of respect between Queen Victoria and all the British then, and so when the Irish were run out of England, America took the immigrants, but they didn't. But they pretty much relegated them to being washerwomen and people who cleaned house, and they pretty much were a servant class, just like the blacks and the Hispanics. So I heard all those stories, and all that added up to a very strong feeling that's stuck with me all my life about that sort of thing.
Alright folks, that's it for this episode. I'll pick up where I left off next week with the second part of my interview with Murphy. I'd like to thank Michael Martin Murphey for taking the time to visit with me. If you'd like to find out more about Murphy, you can visit michaelmartinmurphy.com. If you'd like to find out more about me and this show, you can visit andyhedges.com. If you'd like to help me keep this show going, you could make a donation on my website, or you could purchase one of my albums. You could also leave a review on the iTunes store and take the time to email a link to a friend who you think might enjoy the show. If you'd like to contact me with questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Please email andy@andyhedges.com. I might even read an email on a future episode. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.